gente ha favorecido, ha permitido.
Just one more minute and we will start.
Hello, everybody.
Good morning.
Good morning, good days.
Good
Hello,
morning.
everybody.
Good morning.
Good morning.
Good morning from Ireland. Good evening from Ireland.
Good afternoon.
Good evening from Ireland.
Gente que dónde está.
Good evening from England.
Good
Good
day.
morning from San Francisco.
Good evening from South Dakota.
Good day, from New York.
Good afternoon from Chicago.
Greetings from Bronx, New York.
Greetings from
Good evening
Queens, New
from-
York.
Brooklyn, New York.
Good evening from Queensland, Australia.
Good morning, New Zealand.
And good afternoon from Toronto, Canada.
Afternoon.
Good evening from Llandudno in Wales.
Good morning from Australia, sorry.
Good afternoon from Toronto.
As you can see, Ambassador, we have so many people on the grassroots level joining us today. I would have to ask you, everybody, to mute yourselves right now for a better quality sound. And I would give now the floor to Barbara to moderate our discussion today. Thank you everyone for being here on behalf of the Grassroots Task Force and looking forward to our discussion. Again, please mute yourself. Thank you so much.
Good morning, good afternoon, good evening from across the world. You're joining us, which is wonderful. Welcome to this virtual side event of the Grassroots Task Force of the NGO Committee for Social Development. We are really thrilled to have so many of you from across the world with us today. As was already mentioned, we ask that you keep your microphone muted during this event because background noise can be very distracting. We also would like you to know that this event is being recorded. So if you do not want your face to show, please turn off your camera. So let us begin. Today, March 1st, the United Nations observes Zero Discrimination Day. And this year, they are highlighting the urgent need to take action to end the many inequalities that continue to persist around the world. It is thus very fitting that today, with our online event, the Grassroots Task Force of the NGO Committee for Social Development launch its report entitled Towards 2030, Grassroots Experiences with Inequalities. The report presents the results of a survey we conducted in April and May of 2019 to see if and how the experience of inequality, which is SDG 10 specifically, has changed since the adoption of Agenda 2030. And we sought to have the perspective of persons at the grassroots. While worsening inequality within and between countries has been acknowledged as a problem in recent years, most studies have focused on the wealth gap. In our survey, we addressed the question, how do people on the ground experience inequality? Knowing that inequalities are multidimensional and can include such things as housing, access to education, healthcare, and many other. We recognize that inequalities and exclusion can be social and political as well as economic. And within the limits of our expertise, we sought to disaggregate data. Today, we will have 5 presentations, each with the speakers sharing their insights. First, we are honored by the presence of Her Excellency Ambassador Maria del Carmen Squeth, the permanent representative of Argentina at the United Nations. Her words will be followed by a presentation of the results of the survey. Then we will hear from 2 survey respondents who will give insights into how inequalities are experienced by the grassroots. first in Zambia and then in Ireland. And we will conclude the presentations with a youth perspective on inequalities. We will have time, we expect, for questions at the end, and we invite you to write your questions in the chat box anytime during the presentations. So we begin this with Ambassador Maria del Carmen Squef, who has a long career in foreign service, having represented her country in France, Colombia, and Nigeria before serving as Undersecretary of Mercosur. Following that role, she became the permanent representative of Argentina at the United Nations, a post she has held since 2020. Most recently, earlier this year, she was chair of the 2021 Commission for Social Development, and she did a wonderful job with that. Ambassador Squef, we look forward to hearing your words of wisdom. Please, you have the floor.
Thank you, Barbara. Dear members of civil society, good afternoon to you all. First of all, allow me to thank the NGO Committee for Social Development, especially the Grassroots Task Force, for inviting me to participate in this timely event and to have the opportunity to address to you in my capacity as chair of the 60th session of the Commission for Social Development. At the outset, let me start by stressing the reality of today's world. It is one of growing inequalities, where the rich become richer, while the poor grow in number and are not only deprived of a fair share of the benefit of social development, but are increasingly denied participation in decision-making at all levels. The pre-existing inequalities has been exacerbated with the COVID-19 pandemic. The pandemic speaks all languages and revealed the unbearable inequality on the world and how the recipes for reducing social protection are wrong. We must bear in mind who are the most affected and most benefited in this pandemic, so that each one from their place makes contributions to create more just, inclusive, equal, and diverse societies. In this difficult context, we are facing the Commission for Social Development plays a key role in implementing the objective of Copenhagen Declaration and Program of Action. We must fight poverty, achieve full employment, and promote social inclusion in light of the current challenges posed by the pandemic. I consider that this event will help us to understand which are the real needs that people are facing on the ground, because the report that you will present is based on information gathered by grassroots community organization in a pre-COVID-19 environment, and as you say in the report, it is a picture of inequalities on the ground before the huge impact of the pandemic. As for the report, it is good that you took into account a cross-regional approach, and you managed to include the participation of community organizations from all the regions of the world. In addition, the result of the report clearly show what are the marginalized groups affected by inequalities, and women are by far the largest group that experiences inequalities, followed by children, youth, and the other older persons. In this regard, let me share with you that the fight against multiple and intersecting forms of discrimination and the consequent commitment to the human rights of vulnerable and historically discriminated individuals and groups is a strong policy of the Argentina government that is reflected in numerous initiatives that my country supports and leads in the international sphere. This is not an expression of wishes. Argentina was recognized in the global tracker launched by UN Women and UNDP as one of the countries that have taken the most measure with a gender perspective in response to COVID-19. As far as the last session of the Commission for Social Development is concerned, that was focused on the role of digital technologies on social development and the well-being of all. I am very happy about the discussion we had and the active participation of relevant stakeholders. We came up with crucial conclusion. We are moving towards a new concept of digital citizenship. If we do not close all the existing digital devices, we are moving towards two parallel worlds, the one in which people have access to digital technology and the other in which there is no access at all. In that sense, when thinking about multidimensional poverty, one of the key dimensions is digital inclusion. This is an aspect that we need to start taking into account when considering the poverty dimension. On the other hand, the Commission was also able to agree on the principal theme for the next session, which will focus on two of the primary objectives of the 2030 Agenda: eradicate poverty and hunger in all its forms and dimensions. It is our responsibility to address the most urgent issues for our people because this pandemic has increased poverty to alarming levels. In count on your active participation to address these important topics in the next session. Let me finish by recalling the words of the President of the General Assembly. We need to have a new social contract that prioritizes addressing the root causes of inequality and vulnerability. The key to this is prioritizing equal opportunities and using recovery to close the gap we see across the SDGs. It is impossible to move towards the realization of the 2030 Agenda if we cannot make concrete progress to close the gap of hunger, extreme poverty, and inequalities. Thank you very much. Thank you, the ONG, for this opportunity.
Thank you very much, Ambassador Swift. You really brought out some excellent points, connected very much with CSAC-D, things that we need to continue working on, and we hope to be able to do that. Certainly the point of digital inclusion and digital citizenship is essential, and we are aware of the fact that that is lacking in so many corners of the world. But the general notion of needing to address poverty and hunger certainly is very, very important, which we will continue to do. And we did see these elements brought out in our survey. So we look forward to working with you going to be able to continue to move forward to bring an end to inequalities insofar as we can. Thank you very much. And now the first presentation is by Dr. Lynn Healey. Dr. Lynn Healey is a professor of social work emerita at the University of Connecticut and the main representative to the United Nations of the International Association of Schools of Social Work. Dr. Healey will present the results of this survey. Dr. Healey, the floor is yours.
Good morning, good evening, good afternoon to all of you online today. We're very happy to have you with us. I'm going to be, as Barbara just said, I'm going to be sharing very quickly the results of our survey. And I believe just a few minutes ago, the link to the full report was put in the chat box, so you each can download that and have the full report at your disposal. Whoops. Well, as Barbara has already indicated, there's been a lot of data that has already verified that growing inequality is a major issue in the early 21st century. And this led to the commitment to address inequality in the UN's 2030 agenda. There are 3 goals that very specifically focus on inequality: the eradication of poverty, goal 5 on gender equality, and of course, the very important goal 10 on reducing all forms of inequality within and between countries. However, we could argue that almost all the goals actually speak to issues around equality, such as health, education, water, energy, food. All of these are unequally accessible around the world. As Barbara also suggested, but I want to remind you that the focus of our Grassroots task force is on bringing the voices of those who are most likely to be left behind into the deliberations at the United Nations. So our focus in this survey was to look at what is happening at the grassroots level. How are inequalities actually experienced? And is the situation improving or worsening since adoption of the Sustainable Development Goals and Goal 10? Our methodology was that we designed a questionnaire. Our usual focus is to design a survey and try to get it as close to the grassroots as we can. This one we were able, through participating members, to translate into 6 languages and distributed this through participating NGOs to their programs on the ground. This was done in May and June of 2019, so it's very important to recognize that this is a snapshot point in time before the devastating impact of the COVID-19 pandemic. We gave people 2 options to return the survey, either by SurveyMonkey, but we recognized in many parts of the world with unequal access to the internet that it is not really possible to spend a lot of time online responding to surveys, so they could also return it in Word. In addition to short answer questions, we had a lot of very open-ended questions because we feel it's important to allow people at the grassroots to really share their stories and opinions and not just check boxes. Therefore, we had a huge amount of data, which has taken us quite some time to actually get into print. We had 208 useful responses from 48 countries that are spread across all of the inhabited continents. This map, if you just give it a quick glance, everything that's shaded, of every country that's shaded, yielded a response. The ones that are shaded in darker colors had many responses. So you see from India, from Brazil, from the United States, there were a great many responses. They represented various within country geographic areas, mostly from more urban areas, only about 15% from rural areas, and a good mix of country income levels. We ended up combining low and the World Bank's low and lower middle income categories because to create about equal sizable groups for comparison purposes. So we refer to those as lower income countries. Our first important finding was that inequality is multidimensional. While income and wealth are the most commonly cited, respondents mentioned many other forms of inequality, especially health inequalities. And remember that this was pre-COVID. We can only imagine what's happened in this area. Inequalities in access to meaningful employment, to education, to housing, and that one, especially in high income countries, and inequalities related to minority group and gender. Many times these inequalities intersect. So one response, for example, said racial inequality is the basis for many other kinds of inequalities, such as transportation, substandard education, and job opportunities. As the ambassador mentioned, women and secondly, children suffer the most, according to our respondents. The elderly also suffer, as do many other groups. And again, if we look at the impact of COVID, I imagine that a lot of this is going to be both underscored, but perhaps we're also going to see some differences. I think in the United States, for example, the suffering of the elderly has been enormous. And I'm sure that will show up in post-COVID research. Why do they suffer? These are just a few quotes from some of our respondents. Some of our respondents really focus on problems of youth. So I'm very glad we have a youth presentation later in our session today and talk about the impact of such things as drugs and violence on youth. One spoke about the elderly and how they're neglected and often live in situations of abandonment, or else are overburdened by having to take care of their grandchildren so the mothers can go out and work.
Want to hear us now?
Has the situation changed? This was one of our central questions. Has the situation changed since 2015? If you look, basically, if you look at all these tables I'm going to show you, look at the comparison between the green bars and the red bars. Because though the red bars are the respondents that said things had gotten worse, and the green is things have gotten better. And you see here that the responses from Asia, there were more who said that inequalities are actually getting better. And that was less common for respondents from Latin America, for example. However, about half of the respondents said inequalities actually have remained about the same, and slightly more said they had improved rather than worsened. This is an interesting finding, and whether this is going to hold in the future will be very important to look at. But lower income country respondents reported more improvement than high income countries. Fully 40% of respondents from lower income countries said that the situation with inequalities was getting better. From the high income countries, less than 14% said that inequalities were getting better. So what's getting better or worsening? Education and health were most frequently identified as improved, especially in lower income countries. Respondent from India said good health and well-being have improved among women and children. School dropouts have been reduced. From Kenya, the number of girls continuing to complete secondary schools, women married without FGM, all have improved. We point out later in the presentation that there seems to be a suggestion, at least, and maybe even a strong suggestion, that this is a result of some success with the Millennium Development Goals, in that we're seeing lower income countries saying that education and health had improved. The inequalities that have worsened, income and wealth, health, housing, especially in high income countries, in North America and Europe, food, discrimination, and prejudice. And again, most of these citing worsened health, housing, and discrimination are from the higher income countries. This is a table. I don't have time to explain it in great detail. So again, I'll just ask you to look at the color of the bars. The table on the left, we asked whether provision and access to services to address these inequalities had gotten better or worsened. The table on the left is the responses from lower income countries. On the right, the table is for upper income countries. And if you look at the comparison of the amount of red and green, you will see again that in terms of availability of services, it's the lower income countries that are reporting significant improvement, especially in maternal health, childcare, and education. And again, the high income countries, you see the areas of worsening situation in housing, especially income and jobs. We then asked about what kind of programs had been initiated before and after 2015, and to what extent those had been effective in actually addressing inequality. Many kinds of programs were mentioned, and again, our full report discusses these programs, what kinds of programs they were. The simple takeaway is that at least our respondents, perhaps not surprisingly, since they come from NGOs, rated NGO-sponsored programs as more effective in addressing inequality than programs sponsored by governments. Why? What makes a program effective? Government programs are more effective if they're well communicated so that the citizens understand what the program is and how to access it, if they raise awareness, and if they include women and provide real benefits. They're ineffective if they are marked with corruption, and quite a number of countries had respondents that discussed corruption, not just in the lower income countries, but you'll see the UK and the US also mentioned there. Rigid rules and bureaucracy, lack of information, and insensitivity to people's real needs. NGO programs that are effective are collaborative, awareness raising, respond to immediate needs of people, use participatory approaches, incorporate women, and importantly, in terms of the 2030 agenda, are able to reach those who are most left behind. One of the things about our survey that took us so long was that we asked so many questions, and I was really interested that the ambassador mentioned participation and the importance of participation in the area addressing inequalities. So we did ask, how has people's ability to participate across numerous areas of life expanded or contracted during this time? Because we see participation as not only a human right, but also essential in addressing inequalities. Interestingly, across all aspects of participation, the economic, the social, and the political, lower income country respondents reported the most improvement. In terms of economic life, people's ability to participate in the high and middle income countries was more likely to be rated as having worsened due to loss of jobs and the stagnation of wages. The situation was rated as less dire in the lower income countries, where more said either that it had remained the same or had actually improved. In social life, it was a somewhat more positive picture, except in the middle income countries, where 44% of the lower income country respondents saw improvements. Others saw relatively little change. And finally, in political life, almost half of the upper middle income country group said that it had worsened, which I think is a very interesting and concerning finding. We know that the impact of other kinds of disruptions in social life, whether it's violence or natural disasters, worsens inequalities and tends to impact those who are most vulnerable more than other residents. So our countries that of our respondents had experienced a number of incidents of conflict, political violence, and natural disasters. The most frequent were weather events, especially floods, as reflected in this word picture. Here, lower income countries had reported the most incidents of all three types of what we might call disasters, whether it's conflict, other kinds of political violence, or natural disasters. It's an interesting finding because some of our other findings were that lower income countries noted improvements, but here you see those improvements occurred in spite of the fact that lower income countries suffered more from violence and natural disasters. Here are just some of the quotes that people wrote about the impact of disasters. And I think the one people living in poverty are most effective. There's a lack of finances to escape, poor housing in poor areas where climate change affect them adversely. And again, from Colombia, talking about lack of decent housing and people forced to build in vulnerable areas, leaving them highly subject to the impact of natural calamities. So we made a number of conclusions based on this, on our data. The first one, as I mentioned before, is that inequality must be seen as multidimensional. There are many kinds of deprivations, disparities, and exclusions that are suffered around the world. Secondly, inequalities are prevalent everywhere in countries of all country income levels, in both urban and rural context. And violence and disasters further exacerbate these existing inequalities. While there are many groups that suffer, women and children suffer the most, but also youth, minorities, migrants, the homeless, and people living in poverty suffer disproportionately from inequalities. Areas of improvement seem to be related to a positive impact of the Millennium Development Goals. The Millennium Development Goals applied largely to lower income countries, and there was a heavy focus on health and education. And those were the areas where our respondents reported the most improvement. So I think this is a very interesting and hopeful finding, and hopefully it can be investigated further. Related to that, just jumping down to the middle of this slide, is that perhaps the lag in the short time span from the adoption of the 2030 Agenda in 2015 to our data collection in 2019 might explain why there seemed to be less positive results talking about improvements between 2015 and 2019. We also saw improvements in gender equality and in people's awareness of their rights. Housing and jobs, however, had deteriorated, especially in high-income countries. NGO programs appear more effective in reducing inequality, especially if awareness building and participatory approaches are used. And finally, the importance of social protection programs is underscored. It's also important to ensure that these social protection programs and policies have some permanence, because we had a number of responses that said that there had been effective social protection programs introduced by governments. And then when there was a government change, the protections were lessened and the situation had deteriorated. So this is, I think, a real challenge in terms of how do we ensure that positive programs have some lasting effect and are not simply changed by a government with a different political philosophy. We came up with 11 recommendations for action, linked to our conclusions, obviously. One is the importance of Goal 10, and we encourage the United Nations and governments and NGOs to carefully monitor progress on Goal 10 and to ensure the use of disaggregated data so we can actually track the groups who are disproportionately affected by inequalities. Secondly, social protection needs to be expanded everywhere across countries at all income levels. Particularly the universal access to healthcare. And this again was really underscored during our pandemic, the gaps in the access and sufficiency of access to healthcare. And it's critical that this be expanded. In planning for natural disasters, the needs of the most vulnerable need to be prioritized. Many times I think in looking at natural disasters, that it's under-recognized what happens to those who live without the financial ability to provide for their own transportation, for alternative housing, and for meeting their immediate needs in the case of a disaster. Projects should engage the most vulnerable using participatory approaches in programs that address inequality, because the process is also important as well as the results. Both NGOs and government need to continue to educate people about their rights and to ensure the safeguarding of human rights in programs intended to address inequalities. There needs to ensure attention to the special needs of women and children, as indicated, and I think perhaps COVID-19 may add to this group. I would suggest that probably the elderly will need increased attention as we look at what the impact of the pandemic has been. And women need to be included in decision-making, as again, as the ambassador suggested. We can maximize the complementary roles of NGOs and governments. Governments have important roles to play. They can adopt fiscal policies, and they can change discriminatory laws that have a wide impact in addressing inequality. NGOs seem to be particularly effective in delivering actual programs at the grassroots level. So more thinking about how to maximize these complementary roles. 9, both governments and NGOs can continue to raise awareness about the Sustainable Development Goals and also to encourage and facilitate participation by grassroots groups in the Voluntary National Review Program. There's a small goal. Eliminate corruption, ensure transparency, and governments also need to provide competent and rights-based public security. To meet these preceding 10 recommendations, perhaps one of the more important ones is that increased financial resources are going to be needed. And these will need to be taken from both national and international sources to ensure that there will be the funds to actually implement projects and programs to address inequalities. As I noted, since the collection of the data that in this survey, we have been struck around the world with the COVID-19 pandemic. This has increased existing inequalities and created new ones. We must ensure that the inequalities are addressed going forward. We know that there's been economic, educational, and health disruption of perhaps an unprecedented scale in terms of this crisis. So we look forward to ways to work together, NGOs and governments, in addressing the impacts of the COVID-19 pandemic. As you access our survey, again, that I believe that link was put in the chat box. You'll be able to access the full report where you will see a lot more texture in terms of the words of people from the grassroots, and also an acknowledgement of the organizations that very directly participated in the data gathering and the write-up of the report. So thank you, and if there are questions, hopefully we have time at the end. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Lynn. That was excellent, certainly. And, you know, the focus that you brought to the fact that inequalities exist in every place, every country, every area of the countries as well, be it urban or rural. And also the absolute need that NGOs work with governments to face these and address the inequalities, and also the very essential role that those who are affected by the inequalities, their voice needs to be heard as policies are created to help them move forward to address what they're facing. So thank you very much. And I do hope that there will be many questions going going forward. And please, for everyone who's there, please put your questions in the chat box and we will take them at the end. So the next person we will hear from is Sister Pat Harvey, who is a member of the Institute of the Blessed Virgin Mary. Pat, who is involved in grassroots development work in Zambia, where she has been for about 15 years, was one of the survey respondents. She will speak from her experience in Zambia, focusing on rural inequalities. Sister Pat, you have the floor.
Okay, thank you very much, and greetings to everyone. I'm going to share some insights with you from my experience of living and working with people in a very underdeveloped and largely rural and remote area of Zambia. But I also want to acknowledge that I am presenting this or speaking from the perspective of an expatriate from a privileged position within a very traditional society. So to some extent, I'm looking through a certain lens. Some of you may be aware of the Gini index, which identifies the scale of inequality within the country based largely on economic factors. And what has been recorded in recent years is that Zambia comes out about number 4 in the world in terms of inequality on that basis. And I think that is seen very clearly, if you compare Lusaka, which in many ways is the capital city, it has all the signs of a booming city, booming economically at the moment. And yet, as soon as you leave and drive westward, certainly where we are, it becomes very evident. The rural poverty manifests itself very rapidly, and subsistence living. And when you get to where we are, it's very much almost a non-cash economy, bartering, people very poor and living on subsistence living. So we certainly see great economic inequalities between the rich and poor in Zambia. And there's also a great discrepancy between urban and rural. Zambia is one of the most urbanized countries in sub-Saharan Africa. And with that comes then, very relatively speaking, a small number of people living in the rural areas and a very low density of population. And so with such a dispersed population, we see that very clearly in our area. And I think the records are sort of like 1.5 persons per square kilometer. And it's very difficult to provide adequate services, health services, when you have such a dispersed rural population with no roads, little infrastructure, no accessibility. But those rural-urban disparities are not being addressed adequately. And it is the plight of the women that is, they are struggling most with hardship in such areas, with poverty, with trying to feed family, subsistence living, and that's exacerbated obviously with times of flood or drought because they're so dependent on the land. Most of the time and the life of women and girls in rural villages is spent carrying water, fetching firewood, wood, working in the fields, cooking and minding babies, and little else. And it's estimated that 27% of females in rural areas have no education as compared with 18% of males. And that's very characteristic. In the areas that we're seeing, a lot of primary school children do not have access to government schools because of distances. And some of these communities start their own schools with rudimentary structures, untrained volunteers, and they serve their communities very well. And we work very closely with those schools. But some efforts have been made to improve the education of girls. A government initiative with the World Bank sponsorship, Keeping Girls in School, where they pay the school fees, they try to give access to girls and keep them in schools. There's a CampFed, which is a campaign for female education, which is donor driven. And there's a lot of peer mentoring within that, and all of the provisions are paid to try and help girls stay in school. The government has introduced a re-entry policy for girls after they've experienced pregnancy. There are more scholarships for females now. And recently I just read about, there's greater initiatives to introduce girls or keep girls with the STEM subjects and technology. So there are some initiatives being taken, and also with women's initiatives for empowerment in terms of livelihood. just trying to support them in life and business skills, even in the rural areas. But huge inequalities also exist in the area of access to healthcare. And again, the rural nature of the area, the dispersed villages, has something to do, the lack of the low density population, lack of roads and infrastructures. It makes it difficult. But while there are great disparities in service provision, there have been some improvements. There's been a decline in maternal mortality. In 2000, it was about 528 per 100,000. In 2018, it had dropped to 183 per 100,000 births. Still very high, but showing significant improvement. More health centres have been constructed. There's also been an increase in the number of deliveries by trained staff in these health centres. But there's still, very difficult access. I was in a doctor's office the other day, who's the district director for one of these areas, and he had a phone call from one of his health facilities. The health worker was saying there was a woman in the later stages of labour, and you have to come and take her to hospital. Now, this is 60 kilometers away. There's no roads. The area is flooded at the moment. It's across the Zambezi River. And the doctor was saying to her, but the boat will not reach because the water's not deep enough near your facility. Can you find an ox cart? Can you get her to such and such a point, which was 1 or 2 hours by ox cart? And he said, we can get the boat to that point and we can take her. And he was trying to explain over the phone, and they were lucky that they had network connection, because sometimes the network is not good. So that gives an indication, but things, the government is trying in these areas. There has been some sort of improvement. But in all of these basic areas of education and health, it's the women and girls who experience the greatest hardships. And much of this can be traced to poverty, but also entrenched cultural and patriarchal values. In large parts of the country, there is a dual system of customary and civil law, especially in our area. Traditional law takes precedence over the civil law. So with such a patriarchal system, with men in headship and the subordination of women, there's perpetuation of discrimination against women. It's true in areas such as land allocation or disputes, marriage, conflict resolution, and basic rights. So with entrenched cultural values, you also have things like early marriages, teenage pregnancies, female initiation, polygamy. These are all very much accepted within the culture. And obviously they're very detrimental to women and young girls. These things are also exacerbated by poverty. For example, you find young girls who finish primary school from rural villages. They come into town to attend secondary school. They may rent very poor structures. They don't have the money to pay for it. They pay with their bodies. You find boys in the school, they get them pregnant. Girls, people keep saying you have to speak to the girls so they don't get pregnant, but nobody thinks of speaking to the boys, and nobody sort of takes the fact that girls don't have a say. They can't refuse the advances of men in many situations. In some situations, because of poverty, parents will actually encourage their daughters to get pregnant, and then they can demand a cow from the boy or the man who's involved. So, because of poverty, people are suffering. So there's elements like that. And social protection in the form of social cash transfer has been introduced a few years ago, and it's a very positive development which has even reached our rural area. It can be effective when it's implemented, but the implementation on the ground has been fraught with many difficulties, and the good potential of social cash transfer has not been realized to any great extent. It's been very sporadic at best. Months and months go on end at times when people are not paid out. There was a big corruption thing which the government, I think, has tried to get to the bottom of. But even now it's restored, but they're redoing the lists. The beneficiaries that started at the beginning are not on it. There's just so much bureaucracy around and very poor implementation on the ground, so that the payments are not consistent. In other areas of inequality, especially in terms of gender issues, the government has strengthened a lot of the policy and legal frameworks for gender equality and trying to address gender imbalances. And there's procedures and investigative mechanisms that have been put in place, as well as parliamentary acts. And I mean, there's greater visibility of campaigns around gender-based violence, and victim support units have been set up in most police stations. There's been more cases of gender-based violence being reported. So it looks as though that there's improvements in that area. But taking that again in a traditional area like ours is not going to be as effective. There's also been an increase in the number of female parliamentarians, and we have a female vice president at the minute. So there have been progress in recent years and but the inequalities do exist in a big way, especially in the rural areas and especially for women and girls. Some of the gaps that I would see is the rural-urban disparities not being adequately addressed, and the plight of women in particular in the rural areas. Flow of money from central government to address the local needs, and especially the needs of women. I mean, there seems to be a lot of bureaucracy or inefficiency in getting, even if money is available in central government, getting it down to grassroots. And one report that I read, in 1 year, the Ministry of Health had a big budget execution rate of 92%, but mother and child health only received 8% of its budget. And one wonders, when needs are so great, why was such little usage of those funds? And if it was not spent, where did it go to? Implementation, like good things have been put in place, like some legislation and policies and frameworks, which are working to some degree, but they're not being implemented to their full potential. Mismanagement, even corruption on a large or small scale are areas which need to be addressed. And misuse of resources, and I speak here not necessarily about corruption, but inappropriate resources given to address needs. Often it seems to meet the desires of the donors or the partners or government rather than the actual needs on the ground. And I mean, one very recent case we had of that, all of the schools in our area received desks or tables and chairs for staff rooms. And many received board room tables with 8 chairs. And some of these went to the small community schools that are rudimentary mud structures. They can't even fit a table into the office or into the classroom. And they were given 8 chairs and a boardroom table, a number of other tables and chairs for staff room. So it's those sort of things. And we've seen that time and time again. Donors come in, build school structures that are more suited to the suburbs in the Western world than what is needed on the ground in a rural area. So I think, and I think, some NGOs and the government would be guilty of this, that, people somewhere else are sitting saying, what do these people, we can provide this. So, I mean, I think women and girls are not just statistics, the needs are very real. And I think people need to ask, and what you've been saying, collaboration with the people on the ground. They need, they need to be sensitized, given access to education and skills. They need to be educated about their rights, and sort of let their voices then be heard where it matters and what can bring about change. And they need to be listened to. And whatever assistance is being given, it needs to respond to the needs actually on the ground, and not what some bureaucrat sitting in an office, either in Lusaka or somewhere else in the world, needs to hear. I just realized, in terms of COVID, we have been fortunate in Zambia. I mean, the numbers are high enough. They're rising, the deaths are rising, but largely we have not been affected in the same way as many of the other countries. And certainly in Lukulu, where I live, we have had some cases, but no deaths. And it's amazing, really, because we don't have the health service to cater for it. But one of the impacts that has been felt very much is the huge escalation of costs of basic foodstuffs. We're a landlocked country that has been affected, the economy has been affected by COVID. And so that has escalating costs for everybody. And that's just going to exacerbate the poverty and the hardships in our area. So I think I will leave it there. I think that gives some idea of Zambia. Thank you.
I'm just going to ask you to wrap up. Thank you so much. That was fascinating. It's really important to hear the voice of the people on the ground and to understand, that these inequalities are so prevalent. It's interesting to hear that the patriarchal society and the difference between the two, if you will, legal systems, so that even if the government tries to move things forward, in the rural areas, there may be other powers that don't let that change happen, and the difficulties that governments face as well. Although they certainly don't address all the issues, as you say, where is the money going and who decides? And I think what's really important, which I really appreciate, is the focus on women and girls and the issues around women and girls. And also the fact that those who want to give some help or to change the situation need to listen to the people on the ground. What are their needs and what will be helpful for them? I hope we have questions for you going forward. And I once again remind everyone to put your questions in the chat box. Now we will hear from Brian O'Toole, who is the International Presentation Association Justice Contact for England and Ireland. He also was a survey respondent, and he will share insights from his work and his experience focusing on those who are left behind in Ireland. Brian, you have the floor.
Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, and many thanks for the kindness of the opportunity to make an intervention at this important report, the launch of the important report. I very much welcome the report because from the very outset I could hear the voices and the stories of those who are furthest behind. What I learned in this report, importantly, was that poverty is not the result of a personal failing. As a respondent, I was asked to give some comment on those who had been left behind in Ireland. In 2008, Ireland was broke. We brought in the IMF. We were being referred to as one of the pigs: Portugal, Italy, Ireland, Greece, and Spain. But even knowing that we were a country who was furthest behind, we had to look at Ireland and see who in Ireland can we and do we consider to be furthest behind. And those people include women and children, migrants and refugees, the homeless, disabled, carers, the NEETs, who are those people who are not in education, employment, or training, the elderly, LGBT, youth, and victims of domestic violence. When I made my response to the survey that inspired this report, I did so knowing that homelessness is one of the most intractable difficulties facing Ireland over the last 10 years in particular. Many would regard it as a human right, but for us, it was indeed a real problem. Since 2020, there are about 8,200 people homeless in Ireland, and of that group, there are over 2,700 of that particular group are children. And this is an improvement on what has been the case, but previous to this, we had 10,000 people who were homeless, but the improvement has come because Airbnb can't sell their bedrooms, and therefore the Irish government were able to move in. But you have to remember that in December 2020, we were in full lockdown. Excuse me, I think there it is. The causes of homelessness, I suppose, are indeed complex, but the headlines are such that really we have far too little social housing, and this is a failure of policy. There's a huge demand for a dwindling supply of houses, which means really that rents are through the roof and getting a mortgage is nearly impossible. In every town and every city, there are people who are homeless, and more we are seeing pop-up tent villages just like this one. There is also a huge problem of hidden homeless, those who couch surf, those who are living with relatives in crowded situations. This mother with her 5 children had to spend a few days living in a car while she couldn't access the emergency accommodation to which she was entitled because she had become homeless. And truthfully, I think children bear an extra burden on behalf of their parents who they see aren't coping. They experience a related disempowerment. Some of the photographs that went viral around this particular time over the last while, you can see in this first picture, there are a number of children who, not for just one night, but for several nights, they spent their nights sleeping in a police station because unlike the ma'am in the previous picture, they hadn't got a car. So this is where they had to stay. They couldn't access accommodation. The next picture shows a little boy who after school would go downtown and was being fed by a kind of a soup kitchen. So the best that they could do was to put down a piece of cardboard on the ground, which was his table, on which he put his chicken curry, and this was his tea after school. Many of those accessing emergency accommodation were given a hotel bedroom, and this really is the only accommodation that they have. But there are no facilities to feed families. There's very little privacy. You can't wash clothes. How can you invite friends over? What about birthday parties for children, or Christmas, or playing even in a hotel? This is not on. And none of this is to mention either COVID or homeschooling or lockdown. In Ireland, we need 20% social housing, which is evident in a lot of the other European countries, but currently in Ireland it is around 9%. In 1999, we invented a system of direct provision to facilitate the arrival of asylum seekers, migrants, and refugees. And the point of this was to allow people a place to stay somewhere in Ireland for a period of up to 6 months, that during those 6 months, the time would be taken to make a decision to decide whether or not the asylum seekers, migrants, or refugees could stay in Ireland. It was a fantastic system if it only meant that people had to stay a maximum of 6 months. But this wasn't the case. The minimum length of time it takes for a decision to be made on whether somebody can stay is 2 years. But in fact, there are some people who are there 7 and 8 years, and some people or some children have been born into the system of direct provision. Currently, there are 7,400 people in direct provision. And indeed, over the last period of time, there have been up to 700 people who have had a positive decision made in respect of the fact that they have leave to remain in Ireland, but cannot leave the direct provision system because there is no accommodation made for them. There is no accommodation available for them. So technically, those people are homeless. These direct provision centres are on the edge of towns, out of sight, out of mind, isolated. We give people in there very little money. They live in overcrowded situations. They are regularly moved. Last Thursday, Ireland published a very welcome white paper announcing the end of direct provision within 4 years. And really, it is long overdue, but it's light on detail. If an asylum seeker arrives in Ireland tomorrow, they will go to that system of direct provision and they will wait there until a decision is made, and that could take a long time. We also wanted to know whether or not those people who are living in Ireland longer than 2 years, as has been asked, that they might just be automatically granted citizenship at this stage. During COVID, 7 women and children per day have been turned away from refuges having approached as a result of issues of domestic violence at home. And the reason for this is that there just isn't the room. The Irish government claimed that they provide 1 refuge space for 10,000 women living in Ireland. But the Istanbul Convention, to which we have signed up to and ratified, insists that there must be 1 refuge space per 10,000 of population, not per 10,000 women. We're the only country in Europe reading the numbers that way. In fact, anybody who lives in a refuge, they're not being counted amongst the homeless. So the figures to some extent are actually being massaged. In Ireland, there are too many people that earn too much, and there are too many people that earn too little. If we were to try and solve some of the difficulties that we have, we really need to try and narrow the gap. There are far too many people on 0 contract hours. Trade union membership is low. The labour market is employer friendly. There are far too many now considered to be working poor, an acceptable term, but it shouldn't be. People who access food banks because they need the food, people who need rent subsidy because they don't earn enough. So therefore, we're actually subsidizing those in precarious employment rather than tackling the structural reasons behind their poverty. We need to view all future budgets, policy and legislation from the point of view of the well-being of those furthest behind. Do you know, actually, I don't even think that decent work and economic growth should appear in the same SDG. Somehow I think we need to decouple this. If you were to look at this little graphic just to show you, every now and again, the EU 27 countries give an idea of how well or not they're doing relative to their achievement of the SDGs. We look at SDG 16 and think we're fantastic, peace, justice, and strong institutions. But we need to take a good look at where decent work is halfway down and much further back, reduced inequalities. But I was interested to hear what the ambassador had to say, and Lynn had to say, and Pat before me had to say, that even in Europe, gender equality is last on the list. So what about Ireland? Are we living up to our SDG promise? Last Tuesday, a think tank called Social Justice Ireland marked the Irish government's card. Every year they give an idea of how well we are or are not doing relative to our SDG promise. We are behind, and there's no doubt about that, but it's not so much about why we're behind. Really, I think the question we need to be asking is, why are so many others so far ahead? Out of a similar 15 countries, that's how we're grouped when we're measuring our SDG promise here. We come 11th out of 15, but just look who's behind us: Ireland, Portugal, Italy, Spain, and Greece. Where have you seen that little group beforehand? In looking at the NGOs, NGOs are often closest to the most marginalized they try to help, but they are in a shrinking space. They often have to compete for funding. They're often so busy adjusting, surviving, reporting. We need to remember that if it takes all your energy to survive, then you are being excluded. And that applies to the person, to the group, or to the NGO. The NGOs localize the SDGs where the government can't or where the government won't. The NGOs need to insist on participation as an equal member of government. COVID has laid bare policy and practice, and lots of SDG gains have been reversed with COVID. This report has shown that it cannot be about us without us. This report says we value all contributions. I like to think that the SDGs have the same attitude that this report has, in that it assumes that all people have a contribution to make. I believe that the SDGs, their targets and their indicators are meant to be used to combat inequalities rather than just measure inequality. And the last thing I'll say is that the SDGs as goals are affordable. Just look at the amount of money that we have used to try and beat COVID. We would have easily paid for the SDGs with much less. Thank you very much.
Thank you so very much, Brian. That was brilliant. You know, and it's just interesting to hear from two very different kinds of countries. Zambia, rural Zambia on the one hand, and Ireland, which is a first world and a high income level country. That so many of these issues of women being left behind and homelessness and identifying the basic needs of people needs to be done. I deeply appreciated your comment about the NGOs needing to work and find their space and their voice even more, but also the fact that if it takes all your energy to survive, you're already being excluded. And I think there's too many not only individuals and groups that are put in that in that situation. I deeply appreciate your contribution, and I look forward to hearing questions or comments from our the participants going forward. We now move to the last presentation, and we will hear from Juliette Fazekas, who's a project manager at Life Project for Youth, which is a movement dedicated to the integration of young people living in extreme poverty and victims of exclusion. Juliette.
Hi, everyone. I'm very glad to be here with you today. So I'm actually gonna show you a video of two youth that Life Project for Youth works with. In Nepal, it's a pre-recorded video because of the time difference. But just to give you a little bit of context before watching the video, I wanted to tell you a bit more about Life Project for Youth. So LP4Y, as we call it, is an international NGO that focuses on the social and professional integration of youth that are between 17 to 24 years old, coming from extreme poverty and victims of exclusion. We're present in 13 different countries, and most of our field action is concentrated in Asia. So through 6 months professional training for entrepreneurs, the youth that we accompany learn English, IT, business skills, and learn how to find a job and become independent, sorry. So they go through 4 different steps in the program. Autonomy step, where the youth integrates the program, where they learn how to become autonomous, where they learn that it's important to come every day and to be on time, just as you would as any other job. They learn how to dress in a professional manner, how to use a calendar, how to plan ahead in the future, etc. The second step is responsibility step, where the youth gain in responsibility in the team. They will have a bigger place in the MEI, the micro business that the youth learn how to run. They will also conduct an internship in a company during this step. The third step is management step, where the youth become the managers of the team, and they will actually manage and accompany the new youth integrating the program. And then lastly, the fourth step is entrepreneurship step, where the youth graduate from the program once he or she has found a job. So today we will hear from 2 youth from Nepal, Pima, who is in management step, and Yalisha, who is in autonomy step. I will just share my screen and show you the video.
My name is Elisa Buzel. I am 21 years old. I live in Patan, Boldoka. I was born in Kathmandu. I am in training at LP4Y Center. I am in autonomy step. After LP4Y, I would like to get a job as accountant.
Hello friend, good morning. My name is Pema Tamang. I live in Santinagar, Kathmandu, Nepal. I am 20 years old. I have 3 family members in my home and I am married. I am doing training at LP4Y and I am management step. 1 week I will go job search.
For me, women are the one who suffer the most in equality. In our society, women are not allowed to do whatever they like. If they want to do job in evening, their family don't allow them, and also not all family allowed love marriage. I think before it was not allowed women working as waitress, but now 2021 my friends are working as catering work. Me as a woman, I also scared to go out at night. I am afraid something will happen to me.
In our community, inequality between men and women have struggle, and 50% men was go job and 50% stay at home. They are play the card and they will go hotel and drinks. This is not good for our family, and human struggle for the pay for rent and how to change our children's future, and they will thinking, and they have we have many things our life. We will go other place then better than this place, but we can go other place because we have not enough for money for our life. For me, human inequality are strong because they will work to morning to night at home, and they are work many things they are managed, just like rent, baby caring, food, hygiene, and husband, clothes, many things they are managed, but they have not time for a job because they are stay at home and baby care, and husband go other place, and they are work too hardly for family. I'm from poor family and poor people. We have the many things our life, but we can do it just like we will be go new school. We need to new knowledge, but this is not possible because we can pay for money. And these people go new schools, he have a new knowledge, he have a new qualification, but we can't. These people go other place to visit. new place. She will see the new things, but we can't. We have the not enough money for our life, but we will happy to our life because we will respect each other and we will help to each other.
In Nepal, we have caste system. There are low caste and high caste. Sometimes low caste discriminate. Sometimes high caste discriminate low caste.
Between men and women, many violence our country, our society, because there is not good, and we will listen. There some place have rape and some place have fighting, and many girls have to find a job, but she can't go other place for night, and this is dangerous. Many people have struggled our life, but human big more because they have managing all things. But LP4I help to all girl and human. They will support. They will improve to ourselves, and they will also help to find the job. LP4I is in Kathmandu, other place. I think we should be make center for village because they are not developed, and we will help to girls and women find the job, little bit knowledge. And before I help to human and girls many things just like computer training, English training, professional training, and find a job also, and they will help to our dream job. Thank you for listening my testimony.
Thank you everyone for listening to me.
Thank you very much, Juliet. I think it's important to note that the two young women that we just heard pointed to the exclusion faced by many women that we've already heard in every country and from every presenter. So they were really agreed with what we saw in our survey, the fact that women often suffer the most from inequality. And we saw from there what they said and what others say, this is often exacerbated in a patriarchal society. Among other things, they often struggle to support their families because their husbands frequently are not taking responsibility. The two young women also made it clear that access to education is not available to all, nor is the ability to find decent work. And what we can also see is that the valuable work of NGOs, such as LP4Y, attested to by these two young women, corroborates our finding that NGOs are very effective or can be very effective, more effective than many government programs in addressing inequality at the grassroots. So thank you, that was very good. We have about 10 minutes now, a little over 10, for some questions. Despina, would you like to give us the questions that have come, please?
Thank you everyone for your comments. Very really appreciate it. Very great comments and acknowledging our work. Thank you for that. Barbara, you can take two questions for now. The first one is from Beth Plisman from Loreto community. And she asks if there were any connections related to food access, functionality of food systems. Would you like to take that now? I guess, Beth, you're referring to the connections between the type of inequality and the food access. Is that it? Beth, are you there?
Well, yes, sorry. I was just wondering, is our one presenter from Africa mentioned the access to food is getting much more challenging with, especially now with COVID. I know in the US, there was, lots and lots, literally tons of food wasted because the systems were not adequate to handle the challenge of COVID. And so it was just such a distressing fact for me when I was an adult to find out that there is indeed enough food to feed everyone in the world. It's just how it's distributed. So I know you had asked about, hunger as related to homelessness. and housing, but I'm just curious if anything came forth about, farming, hopes of regenerative agriculture. In terms of work training, is agriculture considered viable, even though it may not be as prevalent in urban areas as it is in rural? I'm just curious. Ireland has some of the best food I've ever tasted. I had the pleasure of visiting there once, and there was just such a wonderful local food infrastructure in that country. I'm just curious how it played out in your survey overall.
Thank you, Beth. Pat, Lynn, Brian, would any of you like to respond to this?
I'll start if you like. In relation to Ireland having lots of good food, you're right, absolutely. I would say though, in the SDGs that were measured when it came to looking after the environment, of the 15 countries I showed you, Ireland came last, would you believe? We couldn't even believe it ourselves, but that's how it is. But in terms of the homelessness, food is a big issue. When I mentioned people living in direct provision, the fact that they can't cook for themselves, yet have to have canteen style food for maybe 6, 7, 8 years, that's a difficulty. For people living in homelessness and hotels who cannot cook food for themselves or prepare food, they're living in a very poor diet. Obesity is one of the targets and indicators that is measured when we measure our SDGs at home, and Ireland, a bit like the UK, are not good when it comes to obesity. In terms of the other aspects of the report, because I had read the report, I was lucky enough to get an advanced copy, and agriculture features quite widely in the report. And if you download the report and have a read through the report, what you will see is you'll see the experience of other grassroots organizations, and you'll see how agriculture figures and how people try to make sure that not only is the food system working well, but that improvements are made so that nobody is left behind. Because as you rightly point out, there are issues of food, agriculture, access, and actually SDG 5, gender equality, as Pat Harvey actually said earlier on, is a big problem for a lot of people relative to food. But, I think in Ireland, things are not bad as they stand. However, I think around the world and in the report, you'll see there is a very fair commentary across the board, but it doesn't, if you like, it wasn't highlighted, I think, in the presentation, but you will see it referenced in the report. Thank you, Beth. Thank you.
Pat or Lynn, would you like to respond?
Well, one of the, it was interesting because when we asked, which inequalities do you see? There were some responses that said food, but it was kind of down the list. However, I think it is, there's so many intersections between poverty and many of the homelessness that in fact, access to food would be, certainly would show up. The other place it did show up more extensively, perhaps, is in the discussion of natural disasters, where it talked about the destruction of the environment, about climate change. There was a response from Brazil that talked about the indigenous peoples and how soy agribusiness and the destruction of the Amazon was changing the nature of agriculture and diminishing food supply for the people who live there. So I think there's a lot of intersections here. And I agree with Beth, who asked the question, that if we looked at it now in terms of the impact of COVID, certainly in my community, where we see lines and lines of cars every day lining up to get free food. And these are people who own cars, who never asked for help before in their lives, who now suddenly can't afford to put food on the table in one of the wealthiest states in the United States.
Thank you. Thank you, Lynn. Pat, would you like to respond to that or no?
Yeah, well, just a few comments. I think, with the COVID thing, the expense of some basic foodstuffs, but the subsistence farming, I think is a dicey, it's very dependent on climate, it's very dependent on local conditions. And if there's flood conditions, people are in problems. If there's drought conditions, as we have. And I think, the government to help people diversify, because there's a lot of dependence on maize, which needs a lot of fertilizer, which is a handicap for the poor people. Anyway, so diversification, and also growing cashew plantations and so on. The government is trying. They have field officers out in agriculture and so on. So there's some sense, and like in terms of, I remember years ago when we were here, there was a lot of food aid coming in from the States, for example, and that's not really the answer, because some of the people, it was for AIDS programs at the time. they were saying, we don't eat this buckwheat. It was an anomaly to their diet basically. And I think a better measure would be for the government to buy from the local people in times of plenty and store it, and then sort of use the locally grown materials in times of drought or in times of hardship. But I think, there's various elements being adapted. And certainly the government is trying to diversify agriculture and trying to help people in the poor areas to some extent. Yeah.
Thank you. It's just interesting to see from different perspectives. The same reality takes different shapes and different perspectives. Spina, are there other questions?
Yes, there is the next one, Barbara, coming from Danny Deborov. He's representing the World Roma Federation. He stressed a lot about the need on raising awareness regarding inequalities among minorities. And he's asking our panelists what they think is the best way as an NGO who tries to get the attention of governments to work towards implementing the recommendations in the presentation, in the report, especially again when it comes to the inequalities among minorities.
So we put that out. Would any of the three panelists like to respond to that question, which is certainly an important one?
Yeah, I can start and say that Ireland has produced a Roma and traveller inclusion policy as part of its suite of inclusions. Only recently, the travelling community in Ireland have been recognised as an ethnic group, as a group that have been left furthest behind. And the Roma community are a community who have visited and sought asylum in Ireland in their numbers. Absolutely, awareness is the key. And if we are to frame their success and their inclusion as part of the SDGs, then realistically we have to create an awareness around the SDGs. In Ireland, we suspect, or we have been told, that about 26% of people in Ireland have heard of the SDGs. We don't actually believe that that really is the case. Though we are very dependent on the government to try and drive an awareness campaign around making sure that everybody knows about the SDGs. In actual fact, primary school children know about them more than anybody else because they're doing them in school. However, we are, as part of the NGOs, I suppose the NGOs, as I said earlier on, are fighting for their own space. And in order to keep that space and in order to be able to put their best foot forward, they need to be complemented by the governments. They need to be regarded and included by the governments. They need to be allowed to participate rather than just be consulted when things are going on. They are being deliberately left behind, and the SDGs are demanding that we're told that it's a parallel delivery of the SDGs, which is hand in hand with civil society. And in actual fact, if this report does anything, it shows you that the NGOs are closer to those marginalized. And I mentioned already, I think, that the NGOs are really the groups that are localizing the SDGs where the governments can't, or perhaps where the governments won't. And maybe that's the issue with regard that addresses the question best, where Roma and traveller folk need to be included. It is the NGOs are the interface between the state provision and that inclusion, but they need to be included properly. So maybe I'll stop there. Thanks.
Thank you. Lynn or Pat, would you like to give a brief response to that question? Our time is running short, so that's why I say brief.
Well, I just, in addition to what Brian said, I mean, I think this is a huge question in terms of how we do this. And we've seen in some countries, including my own over the last few years, a climate that really feeds into blaming others for your own misfortune or being concerned that other groups are somehow getting ahead. And this is very destructive in terms of the divisions in society. So I think it's a big emphasis. Certainly, I think NGOs are the ones to lead on this. Government ultimately has huge responsibilities, but to ensure that the voice and the needs of minority groups, whether they be the Roma, whether they be refugees, other kinds of domestic minorities, are recognized, are documented. Disaggregated data is critical, but that we also attack this from more of a value and social cohesion point of view. So big question, a lot of work ahead.
Pat, would you you have any comments?
Yeah, just what, I mean, Brian mentioned participation and not just consultation. I mean, I think so much of this comes down to we don't include people. I mean, sometimes there's a token sort of asking people for their comments or something, but you know, we don't engage people enough, I think, and to hear their views and to hear their experience and to make that part of any process of inclusion. Because we actually have to get to know people and understand people before decisions can be made, you know, sort of about them. It's with them. Decisions should be made with people and sort of learning from them and getting their experiences rather than just a token sort of consultation. Thanks.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Ambassador Squeff, are you still with us? I don't seem to see
No,
you.
Barbara, she had another engagement, and even though she thanked us for inviting her and assured us that, you know, this event was very insightful for her as well. She had to leave, unfortunately, but that's okay. I think that everybody here understands that.
Okay, thank you. Thank you so much for your participation, the panelists. It was very, very informative.
We have another last question.
Can we take the time?
Just one last question from.
Okay, sure. Okay,
yeah.
go.
Teresa Blumstein, the New York JCOR coordinator, the Justice Coalition of Religious. Are any of the panelists involved in or aware of efforts to educate or inform communities toward a common good worldview, rather than an individual success worldview that can move us toward cultural attitudes about the proper distribution of wealth? So if anyone is willing to take that.
That's a big question. I can start. I can tell you that I am involved here in Ireland as part of work with the International Presentation Association, that we are involved with schools that are working to try and include as part of global citizenship education, that really the SDGs are not achieved at home until they're achieved abroad. And in other words, that as a country, as a wealthy country, we have a duty to make sure that SDGs and every effort is made to deliver the SDGs abroad. Equally true at home, we try and press the government on their overseas development aid contribution. They have said that they intend to contribute up to 0.7% of GNI towards this. They're creeping up towards that, but they'll never quite get that far. We're not best placed to deliver that at the minute. But I think in primary schools and in secondary schools and in NGOs, there is a greater awareness of the SDGs. And it looks like we're kind of coming to a space whereby we're looking further than the end of our own nose. And we're now taking greater cognizance of those further behind and further away from us. Thanks to Spina.
Wonderful. Lynn, Pat, would you like to comment?
Well, I think, as many of you know, the United States, some of us don't wish to, but some of us are just, you know, struggling to climb out of a few years of globalism is dead, every country for itself. So, you know, we have an enormous amount of work to do to change the conversation here in the US. It also occurs to me that the COVID pandemic provides the ideal opportunity, because basically no one's safe until we're all safe.
Yeah, I think for me, I mean, it's probably in a much more limited way, because I mean, so many of the people that we're working with, they don't have a worldview, in that they have very little connection with, you know, sort of with the media and so on. But I mean, certainly the groups that we're working with, we try to educate them about the millennium or the, you know, sustainable development goals, about their rights and so on. And I mean, I must say, my interaction with local government officials, I mean, I would challenge them more sort of, you know, as to what they're about and the implementation of things in that wider framework. And I mean, a few years ago, we stopped a vehicle that, I mean, it was, I think it was a UN vehicle and had SDGs written along the side of it. It was the time of, or the Millennium Development Goals. And we asked them about that. They didn't even know what the Millennium Development Goals were. And they were driving a vehicle with it emblazoned on the side. So, you know, it's, so we take opportunities like that. But I mean, most of the people that we're working with have a very narrow sort of, their lives is their village, basically. Thanks.
Very different perspectives, but all of them are very important, and we need to listen to one another across the world. So thank you so much. Thank you for your attention. Thank you for your participation. Before we close, I would like to acknowledge the many persons who have had a hand in the survey and its analysis. It's a long and difficult work. But one person who had a major hand in the work is daughter of Charity, Margaret O'Dwyer. And regretfully, she is unable to be with us today due to a serious health issue. So let us remember her. And as we close, I would like to remind everyone that you can access the full report on the website of the NGO Committee for Social Development. And Despina has also put it into the chat box, so it's available there. And I thank you very much for participating. And my wish is that we all continue to work together wherever we are to address inequalities and bring about the needed change so that truly no one is left behind. Thank you so much and have a good rest of the day, however much is left wherever you are.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. It was amazing. Bye.
Thank you very much. That's the great panel again. Excellent. Good luck. See you next time.
Thank you.